Peter Hill Explains, where I invite you to join the science teaching conversation with me about Immanuel Kant, episode 9. So previous episode we looked at morality and the ability of someone to actually have to be free to make a choice. So it sort of really goes to the fact to say if you've got people who are starving and revolt, you can look at the other factors behind morality rather than just assess them by their actions. It's their intent and mind and self-consciousness and freedom. So that's interesting how the early work of Kant is the foundational theories which emerged parallel with our further and greater understanding of things like psychology. So he got consciousness, self-consciousness, consciousness, self-consciousness, and further forward up we can look at subconscious and get psychology. So he's really preempting psychology in a certain way. So rather than being critical of it, to see it as a early formation thought, my overall view perhaps is that we shouldn't be looking at an individual philosopher, but sort of a chain of development of philosophy, rather than being critical of people. It's like learning to ride a bike. The first time it's a bit wobbly. This is 5.3, the fact and reason. Can we know what we are free in this transcendental sense? This is the non-physical sense. Kant's response is tricky. On one hand, he distinguishes between theoretical knowledge and morally justified belief. We do not have a theoretical knowledge that we are free or about anything beyond the limits of possible experience, but we are morally justified in believing that we are free in this sense. On the other hand, Kant also uses stronger language than this when discussing freedom. For example, he says that, quote, among all ideas of speculative reason, freedom is only one of the possibility of which we know a priori, though without having any insight into it, because it is the condition of moral law which we know, end quote. In a footnote to this passage, Kant explains that we know freedom a priori because, quote, were there no freedom, the moral law would not be encountered at all in ourselves, end quote. Which I suppose it makes sense. If you're completely enslaved, you can't be moral. And on Kant's view, everyone does encounter the moral law a priori. For this reason, Kant claims that moral law, quote, proves, end quote, the objective, quote, though only practical undoubted reality, end quote, of freedom. So, Kant wants to say that we do have knowledge of the reality of freedom, but that this is practical knowledge of practical reality or cognition, quote, only for practical purposes, unquote, by which he means to distinguish it from theoretical knowledge based on experience or reflection on the conditions of experience. A practical knowledge of freedom is based instead on the moral law. The difference between Kant's stronger and weaker language seems mainly to be that his stronger language emphasizes that our belief for practical knowledge about freedom is unshakable, and that in turn provides support for other morally grounded beliefs in God and the immortality of the soul. It's really interesting that when people talk of freedom, they actually are talking of a whole lot of other concepts linked into it. Kant calls our consciousness of the moral law, our awareness that the moral law binds us or has authority over us, the fact of reason. So, in his view, the fact of reason is a practical basis for our belief or practical knowledge that we are free. Kant insists that moral consciousness is undeniable, a priori, and unavoidable. Every human being has a conscience, a common sense grasp of morality, a firm conviction that he or she is morally accountable. Very interesting. I can sort of remember some of my father's teaching, or people who taught him on that. We may have different beliefs about the source of morality's authority, God, social convention, human reason. We may arrive at different conclusions about what morality requires in specific situations, and we may violate our own sense of duty, but we all have a conscience and an unshakable belief that morality applies to us. I don't think so. There's some psychopaths out there who don't believe that. According to Kant, this belief cannot and does not need to be justified or proved by any deduction. It's just a ground level fact about human beings that we hold ourselves morally accountable. But Kant is making a normative claim here as well. It is also a fact which cannot and does not need to be justified, that we are morally accountable and that morality does have authority over us. Kant holds that philosophy should be in the business of defending this common sense moral belief, and in any case it should never prove or disprove it. It's actually interesting. So, yeah, this is a fundamental thing of morality. We don't go back. Law stops at a certain right and wrong. Kant may hold that the fact of reason, our consciousness of moral obligation, implies that we are free on the grounds that ought implies can. In other words, Kant may believe that it follows from the fact that we ought morally to do something that we can or are able to do. This is suggested, for example, by the passage in which Kant asks us to imagine someone threatened by his prince with immediate execution unless he, quote, gives false testimony against an honourable man whom the prince would likely destroy under a plausible pretext. This is really close to the bone, mate. My godfather, that's so close to the bone. Isn't that amazing? Kant says that he would perhaps not venture to assert whether he would do it or not, but he must admit without hesitation that it is possible for him. He judges, therefore, he can do something because he is aware that he ought to do it, and cognizes freedom within him, which without moral law would have remained unknown to him. This hypothetical example of action not yet carried out, it seems that pangs of guilt about immorality of the action that you carried out in the past, on this reasoning, would imply more directly that you have, or at least have had, the ability to act otherwise than you did. Therefore, you are free in Kant's sense. 5.5, the categorical imperative. So that's dealing with the actual freedom and morality coming together as a component. 5.4, the categorical imperative. It's interesting that categorical means something different here. I must admit, I fully don't understand what he means. We may understand it by listening to this. In both the book Groundwork of Metaphysical Physics and Morals and the book Critique of Practical Reason, Kant also gives a more detailed argument for the conclusion that morality and freedom reciprocally imply each other. That's interesting. Which is sometimes called the reciprocity thesis. On this view, to act morally is to exercise freedom, and the only way to fully exercise freedom is to act morally. Kant's argument for this view differs from these texts, but the general structure of his argument in the Critique of Practical Reason may be summarized as follows. Now, there's a first, second, and so on. It's detailed first. First, it follows from the basic idea of having a will that to act at all is to act on some principle, or what Kant calls a maxim. A maxim is a subjective rule or policy of action. It says that you are doing what you are doing and why. There's military maxims. I think there's 24 famous military maxims, which I've got to read. You just don't do this thing. I think it comes from the Mongol invasions. We did some really stupid things. Kant gives as examples of maxims: let no insult pass unavenged, and to increase my wealth by every safe means. We may be unaware of our maxims, we may not act consistently on the same maxims, but our maxims may not be consistent with one another. But Kant holds that since we are rational beings, our actions always aim at some sort of end goal which our maxims expresses. The goal of any action may be something as basic as gratifying a desire, or may be something more complex such as becoming a doctor or a lawyer. In any case, the causes of our actions are never our desires or impulses on Kant's view. If I act to gratify some desire, then I choose to act on a maximum that specifies gratification of the desire as my goal of my action. For example, if I desire some coffee, I may act on the maximum to go to a cafe and buy some coffee in order to gratify that desire. Wow. Or just buy a cup of coffee or buy Macca's or whatever it is. Second, Kant distinguishes between the two basic kinds of principles or rules that we can act on. He calls them material and formal principles. To act in order to satisfy some desire, when I act on the maximum to go to the coffee and the cafe, is to act on a material principle. Here, the desire for coffee fixes the goal, which Kant calls the object of the matter of some action, and the principle says how we'll achieve the goal, go to the cafe. Corresponding material principles, on Kant's view, are what he calls hypothetical imperatives. A hypothetical imperative is the principle of rationality that says that I should act in a certain way if I choose to satisfy some desire. If maxims in general are rules that describe how one does act, then imperatives in general describe how one should act. The imperative is hypothetical if it says I should act only if I choose to pursue some goal in order to gratify a desire. This, for example, is a hypothetical imperative. If you want coffee, then go to the cafe. This hypothetical imperative applies to only you if you desire coffee and choose to gratify that desire. That is interesting because you hear people, I was forced to sabotage you because I have this. They can't just see that their imperative is their choice. Their imperative gets their confusion between imperative and free will gets confused there. That's in my opinion. There's some pipes and things happening around here as my kids play around me. And I really wanted to play with my kids a bit more, but this goes on for a while. Pages. Oh, God. Okay. In contrast to material principles, formal principles describe how one acts without making reference to any desires. This is easy to understand through the corresponding kind of imperative which Kant calls categorical imperative. A categorical imperative commands unconditionally that I should act in some way. So while hypothetical imperatives apply to me only on the condition that I have set a goal and satisfying desires that they tell me how to satisfy, categorical imperatives apply to me no matter what my goals and desires may be. That is very interesting. That is very interesting. I wish I could actually use that idea. Kant regards moral laws as categorical imperatives which apply to everyone unconditionally. For example, the moral requirement to help others in need does not apply to me only if I desire to help people in need, and the duty not to steal is not suspended if I have some desire that I could satisfy by stealing. Moral laws do have such conditions, rather apply unconditionally. That's why they apply to everyone in the same way. Third, insofar as I act on material principles or hypothetical imperatives, I do not act freely, but rather I act on to satisfy some desires that I have and that I desire not ultimately within my control. To some limited extent, we are capable of rationally shaping our desires insofar as we choose to act in order to satisfy the desires we are choosing to let nature govern us rather than governing ourselves. We are always free to sense that we always have the capacity to govern ourselves rationally instead of letting our desires set our ends for us. But we may freely fail. Now that's really interesting, the organisational aspect of this. That's intensely interesting. We are always free in letting our desires to set our ends, but we may freely fail. What I find interesting is that people can lose track by actually saying someone else desires it, so therefore I have to do it. It's interesting, sort of a two-phase thing. Moreover, since Kant's whole desires never cause us to act, but rather always choose to act on the maximum even when that maximum specifies the satisfaction of desire as a goal of our action, it also is that we are always free to sense that we freely choose our maxims. That's interesting. So organisationally, you can have a maxim that I must always follow the hype official, but and you may have it as a maxim and not actually process it. I don't know if I'll ever get to describe that. Nevertheless, our actions are not free in the sense of being autonomous if we choose to act only on material principles because we, in that case, do not give the law to ourselves, but instead choose to allow nature in us, our desires, to determine the law of our actions. Finally, on the way to act freely in the full sense of exercising autonomy is therefore to act on formal principles or categorical imperatives which also act morally. Kant does not mean that acting autonomously requires we take no account of our desires, because that would be impossible. Rather, he holds that typically formulate maxims with a view to satisfying our desires, but that, quote, as soon as we draw up maxims of the will for ourselves, unquote, we become immediately conscious of the moral law. This immediate consciousness of moral law takes the following form, and I quote here. I'm going to crash through this. I'll be with you in a while, mate. So I'm going to put on a slight German accent for this. Can't imagine. I have, for example, made my maxim to increase my wealth by every safe means. Now I have a deposit in my hands, the owner of which has died and left no record of it. This is, naturally, a case for my maximum. Now I want only to know whether that maximum could also hold a universal practical law. I therefore apply the maximum to the present case and ask whether it could indeed take the form of a law, and consequently whether I could, through my maxim, at the same time give such a law as this, that everyone may deny a deposit which no one can prove has been made, that once I become aware of such a principle as a law, would annihilate itself, since it would bring about that there would be no deposits at all. You see? In other words, to assess the moral permissibility of maximum, I ask what everyone else could act on it. There's a modern principle of justice person. It's escaped my memory. This man. It's the moral law that I think is the best. It's a system of justice. I'll have to think of it. I really can't remember. It's really hurting my head. I can't remember the name. There is a principle that you can get the optimum law by actually considering yourself equally in any position. It's fair. It's a system of justice. A system. If you Google just systems of justice, you'll get up this system. I'll read this again. In other words, to assess the morality permissibility of my maxim, I ask what everyone could act on it, and whether it could be willed as a universal law. The issue is not whether it would be good if everyone acted on my maxim, or whether I would like it, but only whether it would be possible for my maxim to be willed as a universal law. This gets at the form, not the matter of the content of the maxim. A maxim has morally permissible form for Kant only if it could be willed as a universal law. If my maxim fails this test, as this one does, then this is morally impermissible for me to act on it. Gee whiz. If my maxim passes a universal law test, then it's morally permissible for me to act on it, but I fully exercise my autonomy only if my fundamental reason for acting on the maxim is that it is morally permissible or required that I do so. Imagine that I'm moved by a feeling of sympathy to formulate a maxim to help someone in need. In this case, my original reason for formulating the maxim is the certain feeling moved me. Such feelings are not entirely without my control and may not be present when someone actually needs help. But this maxim passes Kant's test. It could be willed as a universal law that everyone help others in need from motives of sympathy. So it would not be wrong to act on the maxim when the feeling of sympathy so moves me. But helping others in need would not fully exercise my autonomy unless my fundamental reason for doing so is not that I have some feeling of desire, but rather it would be right, or at least permissible, to do so. Only when such purely formal principle supplies the fundamental motive for my action do I act autonomously. Okay, so this is basically professionalism, as I would call it. So the moral law is the law of autonomy in the sense that freedom and unconditional practical law reciprocally imply each other. That's actually quite interesting. When my maxims are originally suggested by my feelings and desires, and if I act on morally permissible or required maxims because they are morally permissible or required, then my actions will be autonomous, and the reverse is true as well. For Kant, this is the only way to act autonomously. So essentially, you're a selfish git if you act autonomously unprofessionally, but if you're a professional, and I think this is what professionalism means. Professionalism means a communal body of formal, non-maximed laws, embodied laws. Okay, that's the end of this episode, going for precisely 20 minutes. Thanks for listening. I'll be back with you soon. Another podcast, another story comes to a close. It's been a pleasure sharing this moment in time with you. May you discover truly amazing things, understand them, and tell others. Thanks for listening.